First off, I'm very happy to see everybody here. I think I met some of you outside the cafeteria and other places. Well, I think we got a very good overview just now from Dr. Chang about the aspects in general about the Silk Road, about the ancient Silk Road, about the new Silk Road that China is proposing, but which involves over 60 nations in the world at this point, through such institutions as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which now has 70 members and $100 billion of financing, through the New Development Bank, which was formed by the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which similarly has $100 billion of financing available, and the Silk Road Infrastructure Fund, these programs that were announced to us by Dr. Chang. Overall, the amount of infrastructure that is involved or is needed in the world is something on the order of $20 trillion. The Asian Development Bank has estimated the infrastructure need in Asia as around $8 trillion. We're going to hear later from Albert Pozzotrigo about the infrastructure needs of the Americas, including the American Society of Civil Engineers findings about the infrastructure deficit in the United States, which is several trillions of dollars as well. When you put all this together with the fact that infrastructure spending in the United States or in the Eurozone is about 3% of GDP, and you compare it to the 8.9%, 8.8, 8.9% seen in China, well, there's no wonder that we have these tremendous advancements of high-speed rail with new lines being opened every year in China, and as we'll hear later, a growing deficit of underinvestment in the United States. So what I'd like to talk about is what the economic value of infrastructure is, because it's something that is dramatically misunderstood, and that's part of the reason that the financing is so far below what it should be in the United States, for example, or the Eurozone, although it's not the only reason. So let me pose a question. Does anybody have a short definition of what economics is? Shout it out. I know this isn't the economics school, but...
It's the interaction of money.
Interaction of money. Okay.
Trade.
Trade's sure part of it. We definitely use money. One common short definition is the allocation of scarce resources, or the means by which those resources are allocated. Many of the metrics used to understand economics do involve money. Metrics like GDP. These things are always, the unit in which they're expressed is dollars or some other currency, or dollars, connected to some particular year, trying to keep in track inflation, this sort of thing. But it's missing something, which is that human beings create resources. We're the only species that creates resources. If you think about so many of the resources that we consider resources today, that our lives depend on, how many of those were even considered a resource 2,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago? Think about how much electricity in the world is produced by coal. Coal was not a significant resource 2,000 years ago. Think about neodymium, to use a more modern example. Neodymium, used in the very powerful magnets that are common in generators and motors, where weight is at a premium, such as an electric car. That wasn't a resource 100 years ago, very little industrial use. Lithium, similarly. A lot of these rare earths, lithium's not a rare earth, but the rare earths, lithium, these are elements that have an application in the world of electromagnetism. That's a new world for the human species, relatively speaking. So, do we use resources? Yes. Do we create resources? Undoubtedly. And animals do not do that. Animals don't use petroleum to create plastics. Animals don't use the Haber process to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere to make fertilizer. Some estimates are that 1/6 to 1/4 of the people alive on the planet today, the food that makes it possible for them to survive, is due to nitrogen fixation through the Fitz-Haber process, through artificial nitrogen fixation. So these are tremendous discoveries that transform our relationship to nature. And at its heart, that's the basis of economics. you start from money, you can get twisted up quite a bit. When we look at the long-term scale of human history, what's important is what have we discovered and how have we used that to transform our relationship to nature? If you consider this chart, human population over time. If this wasn't labeled as human population growth, I still think that most people in the audience would be able to guess which species this is. There's no other species that increases its population over time. There's no other species that's able to change its carrying capacity, a term from biology, right? Carrying capacity, how much of an organism can live in a given area. We change it. We determine it. Animals don't plant crops. They don't build motors. They don't use sailing ships with, to cross the oceans. They don't use the compass. They don't write on paper, right? There's a fundamental distinction. And this is characterized in, I would say, the most essential creation story in Western civilization. Going back to Greece, going to the story of the creation of the human species, we have the story of Prometheus. Right? Prometheus took fire from heaven, took fire from Zeus, and gave it to mankind. As the story goes, this really was the creation of the human species. Animals don't use fire. They don't use and create technologies. This is the birth of us as a human species because of our minds. Prometheus gave science. Another metric, lifespan. In 1800, Belgium, which had the highest population expectancy, the highest life expectancy at the time, the life expectancy, as you can see here, 40 years. If that's the life expectancy, what is the average age of a person in a society? If you're expected to live to 40, how old are most people, the majority of the population? How much skill is it possible for people to develop if they're, retiring, basically, or going to be out of commission by the age of 35? How much expertise can be developed? How many people are working in agriculture? Or how many people are able to study and create the new discoveries that move the human species forward? We've seen a tremendous increase in this. These are really great economic metrics. Here you can see an animation of the change in life expectancy over time. Gray means no data. Development, to be sure. Uneven development, yes. Development, undoubtedly. So let's think about a way to put this in context. Let's think about what infrastructure is. And it relates to the term environment. Living species have an environment around them. You might say a natural environment. They live with respect to resources that they find around them, such as prey, if they're a predator, plants, if they're an herbivore, sunlight, nutrients in the soil, minerals, if you're a plant. So that's the way that non-human organisms relate to their environment. It's a fixed relationship, and it's a natural environment, you could say. For us, we create a synthetic environment around ourselves. And this is what we can call infrastructure. Consider it as an artificial environment. Consider your environment, your social environment during your day-to-day life. Your environment includes a subway, a taxi, electricity, the availability of water in your home, I hope, right? And I hope for most of the world, increasingly so. The food that we eat, how is it developed? How is it transported? We create an artificial environment in which we live. So I want to look at this from three aspects very briefly. Our power environment, our material environment, and our space and time environment as it relates to transportation infrastructure. As far as power goes, this is a chart of power per capita over the span of the United States. There are a couple of things that you can note from this. One is that overall, the power per capita has increased in the whole. Another thing we can take from this graph is that the source of that power has changed. Wood is not used very much as a power source anymore. Very few people heat their homes with wood. You're definitely not running, subway trains. Their engines aren't using wood, right? The development of coal did a couple of things. One, it saved a lot of trees. Imagine if all of the metallurgy that took place on the world couldn't be performed by coking coal and had to be used by making charcoal from wood. We wouldn't have any forests left. They'd all be gone just for our metallurgical needs. So coal is more dense than wood. It allows us to save trees for furniture. You're not going to make furniture out of a piece of coal. You can do a lot more with wood than just burn it. Whereas coal, that's pretty much what you can do. So now we can have trains in an economically productive way. We can have engines where the costs of providing the fuel aren't astronomical. Consider oil and natural gas, the ability to have internal combustion engines, airplanes, fission, nuclear power, the ability to use the nucleus. I mean, the strong force in the nucleus, we're talking about forces that are about 5 orders of magnitude more powerful than the chemical bonds that hold together molecules. So there's inherently 5 orders of magnitude more power available in the nucleus in fission and in fusion than we have with any chemical fuel that will ever be developed, and far more than we're going to get from physical forces like wind or water or solar panels, this sort of thing. So we've had an increase in power, we've had a change in the source of that power, and it's incommensurable. What we're able to do with that power has changed. Coal doesn't allow you only to do more of what you could do with wood. It lets you do new things. You can build the transcontinental railroad. You can have a power plant. Right? So that's what we can say about power. This is a chart of electricity use per capita compared to GDP. Pretty strong trend here. Is this because wealthy nations use more televisions? No. I mean, this is one of the most basic aspects of the ability to have higher living standards. Do you have power? What's the cost of that power? What's the geographical availability of that power in your nation? Right? This is a majorly important aspect. And we can see how unevenly the world is developed by looking at the Earth at night. The darkness that we see in Africa, this isn't because there are strict light pollution rules for astronomy, right? This is a sign of a lack of development. You can see some national borders, if you look closely at the map as well, where different policy, you can see the very clear difference in the outcomes. Okay. Let's take a look at materials. I'm just going to go through these quickly to get a sense of how we've transformed our relationship to the world around us. Look at our use of coal. Look at the production of steel. Rare earths. As I had said before, these are elements whose primary use is in their electromagnetic properties. They simply weren't resources. They're difficult to separate 100 years ago. Their explosion in importance today has come with the new platform of technology that makes use of them as a resource instead of just some rock. Chromium. Fixed nitrogen. I had mentioned this before. This is the process of taking the nitrogen from the air. Plants need nitrogen. They can't take nitrogen from the air. They have to rely on little bacteria living in their roots to do that, unless we do it ourselves and create nitrogen fertilizer without having to use manure or planting legumes in a crop rotation cycle. Aluminum. Aluminum, before the electrical world, before electromagnetism as became a very powerful principle of our use, was one of the most expensive materials to produce. The cap of the Washington Monument is made out of aluminum. Napoleon ate on aluminum and served his guests on gold plates because aluminum was that expensive, that rare. Now we throw away aluminum when we use it to eat. Steel. Okay, so we've transformed our relationship to the physical world. We've changed mineral deposits into ores by our discoveries. Let's look at space-time briefly. Here we can compare two aspects of the rate of travel in the United States. The one on the left is 1800, and the one on the right is 1830. So these are contour lines of time. How far can you get in a certain period from New York City? Now, I presume this is big enough to read, but you can see this says 2 weeks, for example. So this is a contour line of all the places you can reach in 2 weeks of travel. Major change between 1800 and 1830. Why? What happened? canal, right. The expansion of canals was dramatic. The benefit of a canal over a road is that the river is paved already. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to grade it. It's just, you might have to clean out the rocks, sometimes build locks, sure, but that's the benefit of a canal. And you can see in the region where there had been less development of the environment, where the economic environment had not been improved by economic infrastructure, it takes just about, you only get the same distance in a week as you had earlier. No difference, really, if the environment has not been improved and developed. 1857. Now we're looking at being able to get across the country. This is before, however, the construction of the transcontinental railroad. You can get a real sense about where the railroads existed. A lot of railroads in this area, and you can see, well, okay, maybe not so much here. And then getting to the, remote areas is very difficult still. Wow. 1930. So again, 1857, 1930. You can reach anywhere in the country in about half a week. What does that do to the nation as a nation? Both socially, in the fact that you can actually go other places in the country and meet other of your fellow citizens, and economically. What does it mean if you can now be not a final goods producer, but an intermediate goods producer? You're able to add value along the way. You can produce something, and the ability to ship it somewhere else isn't so prohibitive that now we can have more specialization. You produce these components, they're shipped for additional assembly elsewhere. This was what developed in the, now unfortunately we call it the Rust Belt, but an area rich with canals, railroads, and economic connectivity. So our environment is transformed in an economic sense by infrastructure. We still haven't talked about any dollar values yet, right? I think this is one of the peaks. Okay, here we have China. So now I want to talk about 3 problems to understand the value of infrastructure. 3 problems that economists run into when they try to understand the value of infrastructure, technology, or science. Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Future platforms. Okay, very briefly. Fusion power, the development of nuclear fusion, this is going to completely transform our relationship to the world around us in a way that's unparalleled since, say, the development of the steam engine. If we're able to turn deuterium into power, if we go to the moon, as has been proposed for a couple of decades or has even been mentioned by China's space program, to mine the isotope of helium-3 on the moon, which is an excellent isotope for fusion with deuterium because the products are all charged, meaning you're not going to have any neutrons that are just running and hitting your reactor. You're able to direct the output. New relationship to nature, new relationship to water, for example, if we can desalinate more easily. For 100 watts per capita, you could desalinate all of the domestic water needs for California's coastal counties. And it would only require about 80 plants the size of the Carlsbad plant, or 35 plants the size of the Sorek desalination plant in Israel, which is a very modern and very efficient one. Okay. So, difficulties in measuring its value. One is that the payback is incommensurable with the cost. More on that in a moment. Second, the value is non-local. You can't add up the parts where the value is produced. And third, the return is very indirect. This is one of the difficulties of trying to say that we can use public-private partnerships, for example, to finance infrastructure. There are only some projects that PPPs will work for. And where they work, they will attract private capital, and they can do useful things. But there exist many useful investments where a PPP approach is impossible because the return is indirect. So a little bit more about each of these. Incommensurable. In 1976, a study was done to say, what is the value of research money going to NASA? They came up with a number. Chase Econometrics said that investing $1 billion every year in a decade, you will have had $83 billion of growth. An 8-to-1 return, in other words. Overall GDP is 20 billion higher at the end of that decade. So 1 to 20, 1 to 8, what is the value? Well, here's the trouble. The payback wasn't commensurable with the cost, right? For a couple of reasons. One is that when we went to the moon, for example, with Apollo, well, after we had gone, we stopped paying to go to the moon because we already did it, but all the new technologies exist forever. There's no depreciation of a new scientific principle, of a new technology. So the benefit to the economy of the higher tolerances of machining, of the new manufacturing techniques developed, like electric discharge machining, electron beam welding, Apollo, going to the moon transformed what was possible in the economy as a whole. So the payback wasn't a scalar one. Somebody on Wall Street, they invest money to make money. They spend dollars, they get back dollars. NASA spends dollars and gets back dollars that are incommensurable. The unit, you might say, is different. The value of it is different. In trying to come up with numbers, for infrastructure, a typical value is about $2.50 to $4. This is the GDP increase associated with a $1 spend on infrastructure. So 2.5 to 4 times improvement. But it fails to capture it if it's a new technology. Okay. Non-local. A new discovery is not local in its economic effects. When Lisa Meitner proposed the idea that uranium was not decaying, but was actually fissioning, that the nucleus was breaking apart into 2 large components instead of just emitting an alpha or a beta particle, that was a new concept. Now, she was right about that. A new idea, a new discovery, Einstein's relativity, E equals mc squared, electromagnetism, gravitation. One of these, although it's made by one individual, although often as a result of teamwork, but one individual has a new idea, the entire human species has just changed its potential relationship to nature as a result of that one discovery. The new thought was local, the effects aren't. You have to say globally, what can we do as a society or a civilization with a new technology? This makes it difficult to add up the value of investments in science or in infrastructure, which, if you think back to the changing times of travel across the United States, if you looked at each business and how much it saved on shipping, you're going to miss something, which is the fact that entirely new types of productivity were possible. Okay. The indirect return. And this is the biggest one. This is a very clear one. And I've got a quote on this from recently there was a tremendous amount of rainfall that struck South America, and it caused a great deal of infrastructure and devastation, lives lost in Peru and in Colombia. In Ecuador, the losses were less, and this was attributed to the recent investment in water control systems in Ecuador. And here's what the president said, President Rafael Correa. He said, "We didn't get lucky. This was a result of planning." The president said, "The stupidity of the right wing, which has the mentality of the bankers, of private enterprise, is that everything has a financial return, of profit making. But no, that is the logic of the private sector. The logic of the statesman, of the public sector, is different. It's that of the common good. If we invest $1 billion for these purposes, and we don't recover even a cent, but our agricultural producers can continue producing, and families are not flooded out, children don't die in the floods, this is a social return. Sure, financial returns are important in some circumstances, but in many, we do not receive any financial return, but the projects are highly profitable for the social return. We recover it as a society, not as a government that invests the money and gets a return, but as a society." And I think that statement from President Correa is very apt. The Tennessee Valley Authority, to take an example from the United States, it sold bonds and it did pay them back. But just the increased income tax in that part of the country, due to the tremendous economic benefit of the TVA compared to other regions, the amount of increase attributable to the TVA, that income tax increase was enough to pay for the project, indirectly. Right? So there's a lot of things that give us a value as a whole, and we need financing mechanisms that make it possible to invest in projects that are not going to attract private capital looking for a quick return, or a return, over 20 years, as a PPP might. Dr. Chang brought up Eisenhower and the interstate highway system. This was an example of an indirect return via a gas tax, a means to finance infrastructure without tolls and user fees. So, okay. So, what are we going to do? What's the value of all of this? As we, construct out the new Silk Road, the World Land Bridge, as nations are increasingly involved in organizing with each other and planning out how this project will unfold, as we, in a very hopeful way, could hope to see more involvement from the United States in this in a positive manner. Dr. Chang had mentioned that the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank did not include Japan. It did not include the United States. Among the top 10 countries economically, these are the only two that did not join. And the outgoing administration was urging other nations not to join the AIIB, saying this will be run by China, et cetera. China's going to have too much control. Well, the fact of the matter is this is an investment opportunity to be able to make these projects a reality. If we do the same in the United States, if we develop new types of financing in the United States that allow us to recover the long-term or the large-scale social return that doesn't come from user fees, we too will be able to invest a much greater share of our GDP in creating our constructed environment, in laying out that infrastructure, the power, the high-speed rail, the new water treatment systems, the desalination, if that makes sense. I think it makes complete sense. The cost is not that great. I amortized it out. The cost to a family would maybe be $400 a year, and then the 100 watts of power to be certain that you won't have to worry about a drought. That's pretty good insurance. So how do we finance these things? So I'm going to say something very quickly about 4 principles that economist Lyndon LaRouche proposes on this. One is Glass-Steagall. This is a law that was passed by Franklin Roosevelt, and if reenacted, which there is now support in the House and in the Senate from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and President Trump has said he supports it. So if we get this law, we'll be able to separate out the gambling part of banking, investment banking, speculative banking, from commercial banking. Banks will actually have to give out loans as the only way they're going to turn a profit. We need that to untie ourselves from Wall Street and not leave ourselves on the hook for bets gone awry, and get banks in the business of lending. There's been trillions of dollars in credit extended to the banking sector through the TARP, through quantitative easing, and it has not come out in the form of increased loans from the banking sector into the rest of the economy. It's got to get out of the world of finance and get out into the real economy and make that credit available for these long-term returns. We need a national bank, like Alexander Hamilton set up, like Franklin Roosevelt approximated with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. We need a mechanism whereby the return to the economic productivity of the nation as a whole is the way to pay back for an investment project, where not every project is going to see a return based on, say, user fees. The metrics for this, don't use purely a financial metric. Use a technological one. Is this investment increasing the energy potential of the country? Is it increasing our transportation connectivity? Is it reducing freight transit times? Use a metric of increasing our power over nature and the connectivity and the depth and the strength of our artificial synthetic environment that is infrastructure. And finally, let's spend the money on fusion. The US investment in fusion is so low compared to what it ought to be. And among the experimental facilities we have in the United States, they're dramatically underfunded and they're having to cancel programs. This is a technology that has the potential to completely transform everything we do, from power to materials to water to transportation to creating synthetic fuels instead of pumping oil out of the ground. We can save our petroleum from making plastics. We can get our energy from something that's more energetic than chemical bonds. So if we do all of this, if we work on developing fusion, if we work on our space program, if we build finally the Gateway project under the Hudson, if we develop many of these long-delayed programs that we know inherently have to have a return. So you say, well, why aren't they being financed? So let's set up the mechanisms to make that possible. Let's reap the incredible return that is just waiting to be had as a society, and also, as Tom had mentioned, career-wise, in terms of all the job opportunities this will create. Let's reap the rewards that are just waiting for us if we invest in that next platform of technological development of our infrastructure. Let's do that here, and we can have a very bright future of fusion, of space, going to the moon, of developing nuclear rockets to increase our ability to get to Mars in a week instead of, say, 10 months. I mean, this is really where we ought to be going. And the payback, it's not in dollars per se. It's incommensurable, right? We will be repaid by having a more productive society that will have as a projection onto a lower dimension a dollar value, a dollar profit, but whose real value lies in the fact that as a new dimension has been added to our ability, we've got a new society as a result of our taking the time to make these investments. Thanks.